So progress, I think, requires two things. One, a real understanding that we're all connected and in this together. And two, a holistic viewpoint, which is very difficult to have, of what impacts what, and an open heart to all the parts.
This series, we are looking at a little passage from Margaret Wheatley's book, Who Do You Choose to Be? And she talks about the myth of progress. And so just as an introduction to this conversation, I'm going to read a little excerpt. The myth of progress. The idea of progress is so ingrained in us high achievers and committed activists that you may be surprised by the word myth. Or perhaps you just ignored it. So many of us are motivated to do our best as leaders and good people because we assume that human societies and our species are on an upward evolutionary path, always improving. What would motivate our long hours of dedicated work and our deep longing to create positive change if it isn't true, as Martin Luther King said, quoting others before him? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Yet the idea of progress is a very recent addition to human thought, appearing in the 17th century, reaching full bloom in the 19th century, and then severely challenged by the 20th century's wars that killed more than 100 million people. Progress as a concept or direction does not appear in other cultures or even in Western thought until 300 years ago. So we're really looking in this series at this idea of progress and what that means to different people, both personally and professionally. So what I'm curious about, maybe as an opening question, Mariah, is how does it feel to think about progress for you? You know, this upward evolutionary path, this bending towards justice. How do you relate to that idea?
I would love to think that it's true, and that I'm always in progress and we're moving forwards to something better. I'm also a Sagittarius, so I have the ability to see something on a horizon and move towards that. I think what I've learned in my own life is that in doing that, I sometimes miss other parts of myself or of the journey and then end up at that place and realize that that's never where I really wanted to be anyways. So I've tried in later stages of my life to let that go a bit more and to be more present for what is and to see what makes sense for me in the moment.
That's really interesting. So it makes me curious about, now that you are being more present in the moment, do you still have that experience of seeing something on the horizon, and is it just the journey towards the horizon that has shifted, or have you also shifted your relationship with what's on the horizon, if that makes sense?
Not sure if I can completely answer that question, but I think for a part of my life, I thought that progress for me would be to move into a leadership position and to have a greater positive influence on things in my life and to touch more people or to have a positive impact in some kind of way. And as I've grown older, I have come to believe that there are more inward parts of my life that are just as important and that I do strive for progress. Personally, think it's important to reflect on who I am and my reactions and where they come from and how I get triggered. And I can see progress in that sense that instead of reacting, I can maybe respond sometimes to certain things that in the past would totally get me fuming mad or whatever. And so I think for me, it's also been realizing that there are other things that I may want to focus on, quote unquote, progressing, maybe changing that make me feel personally that I am becoming a little bit of a better human.
I really like that. So there's a shift from external progress to almost this more internal progress. I can feel that tension sit in my body as you're talking about it. The little narratives that appear about, because you used a really interesting word. You said something around it's almost smaller, but as important. For me, that was really interesting about that shift from progress has to be big. It has to be external, or it has to be this thing that everybody else can see, as opposed to it's almost like it's a precious stone that's close to my chest.
More intimate.
More
More
intimate
personal.
yeah. And that shift sounded really important for you.
I actually have a question for both of you guys then. And so what happens then for each of you as you've made this shift maybe from this impact, I need to have a particular effect on the world, turning more towards like, what can I influence within myself? How do I become a better human? What happens for each of you when that stagnates or you have a setback? Like something happens in life, something appears on your journey that doesn't feel like progress. Is there something that doesn't feel like progress, or does everything feel like progress?
I think it has to do with the intention. So the intention to be a good mom. I'm not a good mom all the time, but there's that intention, and feel like I'm willing to take a look and to discuss with like my husband about things that happen and how can we maybe do things differently. And that's maybe more easy to say than experience. But that is, I think, in general, the way I like to look at things. If there's a setback, it's also an opportunity to take a look at something.
I think for me, the bit that I'm trying to let go is of the word better. How do I be okay with just being a human being as opposed to a better human being? Because the progress thing for me has always been such a strong narrative, as opposed to just, hey, what's it like just to be okay with me being me as I am?
But to me, that's progress. So being okay with yourself, that's kind of the goal.
There's a goal. Yeah.
I mean, you shouldn't get too hung up on the words, but that is, I think, kind of the goal, to be okay, just to be okay with who you are. There's so many problems in the world, and we can show up one way or the other, and having the intention to show up from a kind, open-hearted place is something worth striving for, I think. We need that in a time when there's genocide and there's so much polarity and there's so little space for nuance. And so in my little intimate self, the thing that I can do is take a look at what triggers me. How can I stay open? And I don't see it as a problem to think that that might be better.
And so how might you define it if you were going to have a crack at defining progress?
Well, I think we can kind of conclude that humans generally don't have a great long-term overview of consequences. So then it's really hard to know what progress is. And we might be thinking, oh, this is such great technological progress, and then find out that we're actually exploiting whatever and damaging the climate and whatnot. So progress, I think, requires two things. One, a real understanding that we're all connected and in this together. And two, a holistic viewpoint, which is very difficult to have, of what impacts what, and an open heart to all the parts.
Sounds like there's something about the progress you're describing is about relationship to ourselves and to all of ourselves and to all of everybody else.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we often see progress as something external as well as something deeply personal. I'm going for my status, my progress, my bank account, and seeing that as something external, as like your bank account or whatever. And to really move forwards and to come up with some solutions for the crises we're in at the moment, we're going to need a different understanding. and a deep understanding that we're all connected.
So because we know each other, I'm just going to point us in a little bit of a different direction, because I'm curious about how you think about this from the point of view of, you're an entrepreneur, you set up a business, you ran a business, you've scaled a business, right? And one thing that I see in the business world, and this is definitely an oversimplification, it might not be true for all businesses, but there seems to be this, the idea of the hockey stick growth. Like, if the business is doing well, then there might be a slight sort of hockey dip, but then eventually you're going upwards, and it's like upwards in a straight line. And I think that's such a strange idea, because nothing in nature goes up in a straight line. It's something that we humans have created. And so I wonder, from your perspective as an entrepreneur and being in business, how did that feel for you?
I always say I'm an idealist, but in business, I've also had to learn to be pragmatic. And there's a tension there for me, and I dislike it. We can't all be hockey sticks. If something's going up, someone else is going down, most generally speaking. And so that's difficult to look at. And at first, and I still am to an extent, I was pretty excited about the B Corp movement, because in the B Corp movement, to become a B Corp, you're getting scored based on all areas of your business. So you take a look at your HR. How do you take care of your people? You're looking at your supply chain. You're looking at your environmental impact. You're looking at your finances. I'm not sure if you get points for making more. I don't think so, actually. And based on all of those, you get some sort of score. And the idea is, and you don't just get like the certification and then walk away from it and that's it. But then after 3 years, I think at the moment, you have to recertify. And the idea is that you improve. So you improve the way that your HR benefits, or you improve your environmental impact, or those types of things. And I think that to an extent works and is good, because it challenges business owners to maybe take a look at areas of their business that maybe they just think, that's just the way we've always done things, or you overlook it if you're setting up a business for the first time. And I think at the core, there is something inherently wrong with the economic system that we've set up, and where everybody's striving for more, and that's just not possible.
Yeah, I was quite excited to hear you use a little phrase, because I don't hear many people verbalize it in the way that you have, which is about the hockey stick and this thing that if someone's going up, there is a likelihood that someone else is going down. I was really interested, because I've got myself into trouble quite often to start communicating that to people. It's great. We can be successful, or this company can be successful, or I can be successful, but at what cost to someone else or to something else? And how do we start looking at that? You mentioned about this holistic thing. How do we start to do that? And that feels really challenging, because that challenges so much of our current models of doing business and relating to people. That's from sport to everything. The winner is seen as the one that is of value. Do you know what I mean? I've sat in conversations with entrepreneurs where they'll say, being second best it's not enough. It's not a possibility. I have to be the best. And I'm like, well, so we just carry on living this story where someone's going to lose. That feels such a big thing exciting thing to change, to turn. And then I think, well, we would see that as progress.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's where, B Corp has challenged and is challenging still larger companies to not only look at their numbers, at their financials, but to start to look at other areas and to progress on those areas as well. But for me, I think fundamentally something bigger needs to happen. And I don't have the answers how to do that or where to start.
Without putting you under pressure, and I know you say you don't have the answers for how we do that. But again, going back to a question I asked earlier about how would you describe the business world or the economic world that you think would be could be different in the future, how would you describe it? What would it look like? So that's a huge question.
It's a huge question. I mean, I really don't know, but I think we need to look at regenerative practices. So things that are regenerative, ways to make things regenerative, and we need to have a holistic viewpoint. Everyone needs to have a holistic viewpoint towards their part of whatever they're doing. So it requires getting a whole lot of people on board.
I think you say that really nicely. You know, what's inherent for me when you use the word regenerative is that you're looking at the health of a system. I like this notion that we could look at our businesses or anything else as an organism, as an entity, and that we could look at that entity through the lens of how well is it doing, just as we would with ourselves, our own bodies, minds. You know, we can gauge where we might be on the scale of well-being, and we can also start to move towards a better sense of well-being because we can often sense that from the inside out, right? We can acquire the tools to help us do that. And I think we could do the same thing with a business. My curiosity comes at the point where, you know, if you take nature as a model, and we would say we are nature and everything we do is an extension of nature because we're all in the same universe, right? So in some ways, we're all governed by the same underlying laws. At what point does it become really important to know when the system is ready, the organism is ready to die and make space for something else? Compost.
I was
right?
just thinking that. And I think that's where the difficulty comes up, I think, because one, people find change difficult. And two, a lot of people who set up businesses become intertwined with their business. There's a lot of ego. And so they don't want their business to die. They want their business to be the best. And this is what makes setting something up where the system takes a look and says, you know, we thought that this was the best solution for this problem now, but actually it's time for that to go and to move on to this newer thing that we have. It demands a level of change and cooperation that we don't see at the moment, generally. So I am Mariah, and I would say that I'm an idealist, but that in business, I've also had to learn to be pragmatic. And at the moment, I am in a very quiet time of my life, healing and recovering from what maybe you could call burnout. I have burnout symptoms for sure. And so I'm also a mom to a lovely daughter. I have a great husband who I recently got married to, some great friends that I'm speaking to now. I worked for Doctors Without Borders for 7 years at the headquarters and also went to the field. I thought that would be my complete career until I found out that I personally would probably become sick and traumatized from being in a field setting for long periods of time. And so I switched up my career. I became a social worker. And in the meantime, I also was dealing with the fact that found out that I was developing cervical cancer when I was around 30 or so. And from that health issue that luckily could get kind of nipped in the bud, I was quite interested in obviously all things vulva related and health wise. And from that, decided to start a business called Yoni, where we sold organic cotton tampons and pads and brought them onto the mainstream markets. And in the past years, I took a step back from the leadership position and I have been more in a supportive role to leadership. And I found that quite challenging not to be completely in control, but feeling really responsible for the business. And also a little bit stuck, I think, in not knowing how to kind of, quote unquote, get rid of my own business in a gracious way. And in those circumstances, I finally felt myself unraveling. And so I've been allowing myself to unravel and slowly being able to really rest, which hasn't come naturally to me. So that's what I'm focusing on at the moment.
So we're back here for part 3 of the conversation with Mariah. And I'm thinking back to one of the places in the conversation where you, Rob, and Mariah had a very interesting little dialogue. You were saying that for you, you would just like to accept yourself fully as you are, like the full human being as you are. And then Mariah's response to that was actually, well, that is better. Like, that is progress. Progress is when you can accept yourself as you fully are. And it just started off this cascade of reflections around the field of self-development and what we may have done with this notion of being better. And I'd be really curious to have a conversation with you about, does it help us to actually have this notion of progress, of moving towards something that is better, whatever we define that as? Or is that in itself inherently skewed because it presupposes that what we are now is worse?
Yeah, that bit that you've just said at the end, that's the bit that I wonder about, is that this, to be better, I have to accept that what is now isn't okay. So you talked about the world of personal development. You know, I've been involved in that for 30 years. And phrases like being a better version of yourself. I remember running a coaching course once with someone, and this person I was running with loved that phrase about helping people reach their full potential. And I had a friend of mine who has a disabled wife, and he really challenged the idea of, what do you mean by reaching your full potential? Because we all have human, it's not even limits, so that's not the right word, but we have some boundaries around who we are and what's possible, and that's okay. And then as soon as we talk about reaching your full potential, especially, this is what I experience, is I feel like I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to arrive. I'm never going to be okay because I'm never going to reach my full potential. It's not possible. And who decides, in any case, what that means to reach their full potential? So I do wonder. I was on a walk this morning in the woods, and I was thinking about this. And I says, I'm curious about when we say to someone, you know, whatever it is, whether it's a coaching course or whatever program it is, come and reach your full potential, and you will feel better. It will feel different. You will feel different in the world in some way. Is any different than saying, hey, buy this new car, a convertible car, and go for a drive on the beautiful, coast around Italy, and you will be a better human being? And I'm wondering whether we've got those two things a little confused, that we're selling the same stuff. We're selling the idea of something that actually isn't, maybe not true. So that's the book. That's where I go with it.
So I see two things happening that I want to add into the reflection here. So one is, I am intrigued with this phenomenon, and it's described in one of Malcolm Gladwell's books. Is that his name? I think so. Where he talks about the 500-meter run, or the 1 mile run that was, everybody did it in 4 minutes, or nobody had done it under 4 minutes until some athlete came along and did it in 3.7 minutes. And then all of a sudden, all the other athletes were also able to do it in 3.7 minutes, almost like miraculously, although for years, that particular barrier that had not been broken. And so on the one hand, there is this phenomenon that appears that when single humans are able to cross boundaries, are able to mirror or reflect or showcase, is probably the right word, showcase the possibility of something, then all of a sudden, because we have a framework for it, that becomes available to a greater mass, which I think is really interesting. And then on the other hand, what I see happening, I think, in the self-development world is where these people who have become these icons, in a way, become the thing that everybody strives to become. So I know that you and I have spoken before about, for example, Tony Robbins. And Tony Robbins, I think, is an icon like that. I think Tony Robbins is phenomenal at being him, and he has overcome incredible circumstances in his own life. And he has created something really remarkable for himself. But what I see is that the effect on the world is that everybody tries to be Tony Robbins instead of everybody understands that he's a metaphor for something that is possible inside of each of us, and that it will probably look really, really different to Tony Robbins because none of us are Tony Robbins. And so it's that in that sort of space in between that I think the most interesting work can and needs to maybe happen. I don't think inherently that there's anything wrong with this idea that there might be some untapped potential inside of each of us. But the question is, how do we create the circumstances where people can start to explore what that could be for themselves and enjoy the process while they do it?
I have lots of stuff going. I have lots. I have my own internal thing around, will I ever be fully me? Will I ever reach my potential? Do you know what I mean? I have quite a big story around that. And then the role models who allow us to see that we can do something different. I think so. It's almost like there's this tension in the middle of this. And I think there's something about, when you were talking about what happens when we start to compare what the fulfilling of potential, to use that word, what that must look like. I think that's really problematic, because then if I don't reach that, then I'm not better. As opposed to maybe that's just not the way I'm meant to turn up in the world. I turn up in a different way.
So listening to you, the thing that strikes me and that I become curious about is maybe what we've done in our sort of modern Western culture is we've made it about the end result. We've made it about the goal. We've made it about the car, as opposed to, I was reading an article about Socrates earlier and his view on self-development. And I really liked the way it was phrased and framed because, and I haven't verified this, but if the article is correct, then Socrates' view on self-development was really about self-awareness, self-knowledge, generating more and more awareness of who you truly are or what's alive for you or all the hidden parts that we don't always look at. And then part 2, it was about this collecting of wisdom. So listening to the voices of others, but also becoming more knowledgeable in all areas of life. So from politics to the natural world, right? And just being in this sort of gentle rhythm of collecting more information or more knowledge. And then the third one was about virtue. So living according to a particular moral compass. And that, funnily enough, I think that almost points to like certain anchors that we could have internally. Like, there is these anchors, these lenses. Like there's this lens of self-curiosity, self-awareness. There's this lens of, this relational awareness, this awareness that comes from being in a relationship to the world. And then there is this moral compass about how do I want to be in the world? What are the virtues that sustain my well-being and my ecosystem? Which that talks about the mechanism of development, self-development, but it doesn't talk about a goal. It doesn't say like you need to end up there.
Listening to that description from Socrates, so it seems like he was quite a wise man all those centuries ago. There's something about the separation away from what it needs to look like at the end, for me, is really important. And I think we are so caught up in the measurement of things. We need to show progress. Everything we do has to show progress. And then actually for me, it takes away a bit of joy. I enjoy, go back to Socrates stuff. enjoy the notion of self-knowledge. It's a beautiful, sometimes painful process. Do you know what I mean? Finding out things about the world in which I live is an enjoyable, life-giving, life-affirming process in itself. And maybe that's enough. I think it's when we start to try and but what's the outcome of being more self-aware? Well, maybe that doesn't matter so much. One of my favorite theories around all of this sort of stuff is a thing from Gestalt theory or Gestalt practice. And it talks about the paradoxical theory of change. Because what it says is our traditional view of change tends to be, here's the goal, whether that's a business or an individual goal. This is the place I want to get to. And if I can motivate myself enough and take the right steps and remove all the barriers, I will get there. Paradoxical theory of change says change actually happens when we are fully accepting of who we are, as we are now. When we are compassionate towards ourselves as we are, then something happens on its own. We don't need to set a goal.
I do wish that we had an economist that we could bring into the conversation at this very moment of time, because I'd be so curious to start having a discussion with somebody around what could the economy look like if we introduce the paradoxical theory of change as the premise, as the basis of an economic model. Because I think the whole economic machine is based on the traditional theory of change, or I don't know if that has a name, but the idea of like, if you get this, then you will X, Y, Z.
I was at a beautiful conference 5 years ago. No, maybe longer than that. I had this really weird weekend where I went to a conference, which was a therapeutic conference about our relationship with the planet. And then after that, I went on a week's-long course around social activism. It's probably one of the most intense 2 weeks of my life. It's just like, whoa. But there was an economist speaking at the first event for therapists and activists. And he was saying exactly this: we need to reinvent our economic model so that we separate it from the selling of a narrative that you will be better or feel better or life will be better, it will be improved if you buy a certain thing. He says somehow we've got to separate those two. And we have got them so intertwined in personal development. I think sometimes there's a possibility that we sell people a dream. I feel like there's so much in here, so much to be explored. As we've been having this conversation, I've been trying to monitor internally what I feel and what I sense as we're having the conversation. So what happens to me when we talk about goals, when we talk about being better and improvement, what happens to me? And then what happens to me when we talk about, it's about the process. And I wonder if that might be a useful thing to invite listeners to do, is to start to just to notice what happens when there's a goal, what happens when there's that thing about being better or being different than you are, what happens to you internally? What do you feel? What do you experience? And then what happens when you're invited to be as you are? What does that feel like? And it's not saying that one's better than the other, but starting to notice what the lived experience of those two different things is.
Can I leave our listeners with a personal example of a walk that you and I went on together that highlights this quite beautifully? Because it could be something that they could attempt to do. So you and I went for a walk on a landscape that had a beautiful hilltop. So it had somewhere to the top, like a goal. And I asked you where you wanted to go, and you said to the top. And then we started walking and noticing as we were walking what was alive for you, what was coming up around actually being in the valley and being on the journey, as opposed to wanting to get to the top as quickly as possible. And it was really an interesting process. It was actually beautiful because of the fact that we were able to slow down and you were able to speak to every part. Also, all of a sudden, opened up this possibility to meander down this path that we otherwise may not have taken. And we found this really beautiful little rivulet. and we sat down and we did a meditation there. It's not to let go of the destination per se, but to bring in the additional noticing of what happens on the way.
Okay, that sounds like there's a couple of invites for you listeners just to go and experiment with. We'd like to tell you about a couple of Space to Be Human events that are coming up in the near future. The first of these are our couch sessions. This is where we meet with guests of the podcast and listeners to take a little deeper exploration into the themes and the ideas that may have come up for you while you've been listening to the podcast. We had our first one a few weeks ago, and it was great to have people from around the world, at different ages, different contexts, exploring what it meant to be human. The next couch session is going to be the 27th of February at 6:30 p.m. Central European Time. And the next one after that will be the 17th of April, again at 6:30 p.m. Central European Time. Please keep an eye out for social media posts and posts on Substack where you will be able to book your place. We hope to see you there. We also have a new event that we're launching, which is called Who Are You, Really? Initially, this will be a live event. The first of these is going to be in the UK, in Devon, on the 29th of March. And this will be a mixture of poetry, music, and conversation, where we explore the stories that shape our lives. Again, look out for social media posts and posts on Substack where you can book your place at this event. So thank you for joining us today for this podcast. And we look forward to being with you again in a couple of weeks or a few weeks for our next podcast.